Okay, the word to man. I'm not going to find Thank you. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? It's not traveling. Good evening. Welcome to Parliament's Original. This is the first event we are to visit. Well, we were facility which within the US we have our own, so that we are managing this. I'm very happy to have because the first event of this facility. Before getting to the book, it's my colleagues to give us a mentor to helping. This is the dancing girl of Mozart. Yes, all of you has been for business time, journalist for decades. Now, he's a teacher at university. The most interesting aspect to what I learned from Mukunda's colleague is that you try form as much as content. We should form as much as the content and the way writing style, design. The aesthetic aspect of newspaper has been one of his major concern, which is not there generally with people of my generation in journalism because we think our job is to say something rather than how to say it. We did that fine capability of big journalism as well as elegant journalism. So thank you for bringing us into writing and you're being an effortlessly elegant writer, and that makes it was an interesting aspect. And Rusty still remains as one of the most interesting way of using style to express yourself in a very, very clear manner. But today, we are working is the Great Flat of 1942. And this book is really interesting because 1942, you know, anticipate better. Now, I associate it with an event. It was it into a movement, it was in Soviet came to form that formidable political alliance against Nazism. So 1942 is formed documented perception. But by 1942, was managed to establish is that the known timeline still has some of them very new African development. For instance, if you take this book, some of these sentences were potential to be explored into a full-fledged book. For instance, he says that Second World War began in 1939, that you have to look at it as the year when Japan invaded China, which is about 3 years before the 1939 one. But there are some one-liners which pack so much of information, and for us, the 1942 evacuation of Chennai used 23 two meetings, which was through some of the meetings, and some through Putin's letters. And in fact, the first to Putin's letter in his book. Having gotten family, we don't have anything it's from that period. There was a recollection of that period of the unification when through those lens, and that actually opens up. Though I would like to ask in terms, why did you select a non-human as a topic for a book?
Um, well, sorry, yeah. I think two reasons why I chose to make this book. The first was, in a way, we were brought up with this story of Madras. And of course, my fled Madras. And then as I grew up, almost everybody I knew had a story about how their grandparents left Madras. So somewhere at the back of my mind, this was a story trying to be, written in some way. So that's one aspect of what interested me. I grew up with the story of her leaving, coming back, and being admitted back in the college she went in, continuing from another place, including Madras as about 16, to go to Navadipalli, which she altered her life in significant ways, because she met different people there and our lives as well. So there was that element of it came back from the house completely ransacked. They came back a year later. So there was that. There was the personal element, but then, of course, the book is not only one class, it became a much bigger book. The narrative arc of the book expanded. So that's one story. But to come back to your question about the model event, I think there is this expression I use in the book saying that so much could have happened uh, without a Japanese invasion at the end. That so much could have been triggered, not just the fear and panic of the politics and the influence of the impact on the national movement. To me, is an incredible story. It's almost fiction. So there was this expression I use. There's almost, there's a dystopian futility about the events of late 41 and early 42. And so that interested me a lot. I think it lends itself to certain narratives that throw light on the character of people at the time, the way people, the British politicians, and so on. Sorry, that was a long-winded way of answering your question. I hope it addresses it in some fashion. What was the most interesting element of this discovered when you started into this period? So initially, initially I was looking at Barcelona, and of course I knew that there was a large-scale exodus from Calcutta as well. But as I researched it, I just found the story has not been told. I mean, there are people from pretty much everywhere. They ran away from Ahmedabad, they ran away from Jamshedpur, they ran away from Kodaikanal, Ooty, Salem, Ishwaran, all over. And so the fact that a nation can be gripped with so much is a cost, so much panic. And this panic and exodus was largely unmatched, untold. So this, I think, fascinated me, and was doing this. I mean, you asked me the many, many, many things. So I'll mention one of them. Um, for instance, I think very few of us know, and I'll say this with some confidence, and I'll tell you why a little later, that in the middle of 42, the capital of Orissa, which is Qatar, was actually moved to Sambapur because the governor was so scared that Qatar could be being located in a kind of island. That it moved, and I was in Hyderabad, which devoted access to languages. And so there was a smattering of Oriya writers. And I actually asked some of the Oriya intellectuals and writers, and I actually asked, the public whether any of them was the story. And none of them did. So there were forgotten stories, stories about how the Secretariat in Cochin was moved to Kashmir. So the white people fled Kodaikanal, believing that the Japanese would come to Kodaikanal. Can you imagine Kodaikanal? So these stories, I think, of the kind of extraordinary panic that gripped India I think they're just not properly told. So that was one aspect of it that certainly interested me a lot. The second thing I discovered was that we look at the events of attitude, the Cripps mission particularly, and the events that we took, particularly in sort of slightly formalistic terms. For instance, Cripps mission, we look at it as if it was a bargaining chip. They offered this, we did this, there was a counter offer, and so on. But I think the Cripps mission deserves to be examined against the backdrop of the war, because when Cripps was here, the Japanese came in with their fleet, the same part of the same fleet that went to Zolak. Then Colombo, Trincomalee, they bombed Visakhapatnam, they bombed Kakinada. They took out a lot of ships on the Bay of Bengal, merchant ships. And Cripps was here when this was happening. There was a feeling in India among a fairly sizable section of people that Japan liked in the world. So I found that interesting. And so one of the things that I tried to do in the book was to detail the war actually divided the Congress leaders in some way. I mean, there was Gandhi who had done Nehru and other Rajkot Achari, of course, went on another tangent to And of course, we knew that Bose had his own point of view well before Japan entered the war, whatever. But the entry of Japan actually fractured the Congress a bit before they all rallied together. So that's another thing that interests me, that we don't seem to examine, we don't examine the events of 1942 against the context of the Japanese threat and the perceived Japanese threat. See, whenever we talk about Second World War, the person who comes up in everybody's mind was Hitler and its Germany. And about First World War, Chennai's was about should come from Germany. But with Second World War, we never associated with Japan, and what draws our attention to the profoundly difficult Japan and this part of the world, and even in the which redefined colonialism. How did that shift in your scholarship happen from Germany to Japan? I mean, the story was always going to be about Japan because it began with a story about, evacuation and exodus and so on. But I think the reason why it got better is that it actually fell between two historical stools. I mean, you had the nationalists who had to see everything that happened in the 40s, national historians, in terms of the freedom struggle. So Japan is not a story in the freedom struggle. The definition is Gandhi's called the Quit India is. That's one. The second thing is, as you yourself, you called it a non-event. It never happened. So maybe historians write stuff about non-events. And the third aspect, I think, is the British anyway went to underplay the panic, underplay the chaos. And they themselves are obsessed with, bigger things that were happening perhaps in their own backyard. So as a result of all of this, I think the story got lost. And there's been some things written about it. There's my friend Indigo who's written an essay about it, a short essay. But by and large, the extent of the exodus, mapping the Japanese threat to the politics of that time, I think is a sort of what had not been fully told before that. Duration in which Chennai was empty. So what happens is that the day Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, it attacks Malaya. They go into Tokugawa, which is near the Malaya. Everybody believes that if they do attacks Southeast Asia, they probably have to take Singapore head on. From the south. And that they can come down from to Singapore. But Singapore is the bastion that the British want to defend. Singapore is their fortress. Singapore provides security, to the east. It was their hobby, as far as they were concerned. The naval had and an impregnable fortress is what they thought it was. So I think what we forget is that even though Pearl Harbor is the stuff of countless films and movies and all the great Burma, living Pearl Harbor, from the Japanese perspective, Pearl Harbor was just a sort of interventionist move. It was to take out the American Navy fleet. Of course, some of it was not in Pearl Harbor, luckily for them, which is why they were able to do work so fast. But the really was Southeast Asia. So, I mean, there's a line in the book saying Pearl Harbor was insurance, Southeast Asia was a place. Essentially, what the Japanese were after was, the reserves of Malaya, Indonesia, and so on. They were not interested in attacking the Soviet America. They were just interested in utilizing the army so that they could do what they wanted in Southeast Asia. So that was actually the Japanese plan at that time. So Japan becomes very relevant to us because the moment they attack Iran, the panic sets in. It sets in actually first in Calcutta, where a week after the 12th in Malaya, people start flowing. And about 17% of Calcutta evacuates in 17 days. And then it starts happening in Chennai as well. And there's a pattern to the evacuation. Women and children go first and then guys go later. And in Madras, what happens is there is that initial move that as the Japanese advance, the threat increases, more people leave. Singapore first, there is a sudden upsurge in work service again. The fleet comes to Colombo and bombs Colombo and Trincomalee. In fact, there's exodus from Sri Lanka to Telangana into Tamil Nadu. And then there's more evacuation. And finally, what happens in Chennai is Governor Hope actually says the threat is serious to Chennai. He has false information that a Japanese fleet is going to sail in completely false and going to make somewhere south of Chennai on the Tamil Nadu coast. And this is a full-fledged invasion according to that military intelligence. And then he asks the whole government to scatter. So the entire government scatters except for a few advisors. They go to Salem, they go to Bangalore, they go to Anantapur, the High Court goes to Coimbatore, in fact goes to Anantapur. They go all. So the city is dead. And again, one of the things I tried to do was to find out how many people left with us. So if you take the government official statistics and their communication, which is incomplete, so much left at this time, so much left at that time, and the number is 55% of a population of 8 lakhs. If you take the population debates of the time, and if you take the Indian Express, the number is 75% of Madras left. If you take the editor of Swadeshimitra, the figure goes up to 80 something. And if you take one ICS officer called Paul Jara, who was left behind, and who left his memoirs, the papers in the Vinchlar book, he thinks it was close to 90%. And I don't think that's an impossible number, simply because essentially the British were saying only those people involved in essential services should stay. Everyone else should leave. And there was no food, there was no help, there were no restaurants. And so, the thing about Exodus is it has its own internal dynamic. The more people go, the more people go. It just happened in my grandparents' case. When my grandparents, my grandfather said, I'm going to stay put. Okay? And so he didn't go. People, they had a house on British Road, which is Arcade Road. And then one fine day, the milkmen stopped coming. There's no milk. And so, again, if the milkman goes, then you have to go too. So that happened to a lot of people. The more people in, the less shops, the more people there. So there is this dynamic to the Exodus that, as people left, other people left too, and that's what happened to my family. So I was struck by the fact that, the Exodus was so large. And despite that, I'm sorry, I'm going beyond your question, but I'll say this and I'll end with this. Despite this, one of the curious things I found, since we're both from newspaper journalistic background, the newspapers at the time, whether it was colonial, whether it was British, or whether it was England, see this exodus as a kind of humanitarian problem. The British took it. The British actually tacitly encouraged the exodus, as I discovered to my shock when I was researching the book. But I would have thought that nationalist newspapers highlighted the troubles that people had, the loss of livelihood, but essentially there were single parent stories, about the government is there are no trains to take people out. There are camps if people want to stay somewhere in the way near Chennai. And these were the small stories, that they carried. There was no attempt to address the human side or like a feature story on this representative kind of phenomenon during that time. People running away from places all over India. There was even panic in Sindh, for instance. So all over India, there was panic, and that's gone unmatched. The silences in documentation of that migration, sorry, the silences in documenting that migration brings us to the fact that the reason migration got well witnessed. Immediately after the COVID, when the lockdown was imposed, and quite a lot of people are forced to migration. That is another migration which the European journalists have not done their job and it's a human side to that entire mass migration. But reading about this major impact, someone media seems to be oblivious to those profound changes which are happening at ground. How do you look at it? I, you know, I'm willing to go along with this. We could have done a lot more and the COVID migration. But I wouldn't say it was not covered. And I wouldn't say it was covered in exactly the same way this was covered in 1942. The media did considerably more. I mean, there were people who actually marched with them. It was COVID time. I've seen, YouTubers and independent people marching with them. There was some coverage. How much and whether it was sufficient is open to debate. But I'm making a contrast between at least some coverage and some notice it was on the front page of the newspapers to a virtual, silence. And I think the silence has got to do, and this is my conjecture, not because the people didn't care, but because the newspapers, if you look in the 40s and the 50s, and this is a subject for another debate, but these kind of in-depth features essentially state what Jim said or what somebody said, and they did editorials. The tradition of sort of writing human interest features was not the staple of the journalism of Indian newspapers in the 40s. See, one aspect which is coming up very interestingly was Janagana Mana was conducted in the southern part. How did you stumble upon that fact? So this is again connected to story my mother. My mother went off to Coimbatore. The family moved to Coimbatore. And some people came back at once, but my mother came back a year later. So she came back a year later and she then went to Miss Mills, who was the principal of Queen Mary's College on the beach, Marina. And she said, I finished 1 year of my intermediate and with me in the second year. And Miss Mills rather coolly and flatly said, sorry, tough, you have to do the 1 year again. So this really angered her, and I think that anger was not such a bad thing. So like, okay, I'm going to find a way around this. And so she cast her out. And then she found that the Besant Theosophical College, which was run by Margaret Cousins, um, said, "Oh, come and do your second year there." So as a girl at about 16, she actually took the decision to move to Medinapalli at that time, which I thought was a rather bold thing to do, and complete her, her intermediate, and then she came back to do graduate degree at the Presidential College here. But it was there that Tagore came and stayed for a while. And, I, I mean, we know that he wrote it in the North and he read the Hindi lyrics later. But there is, as an aside, it's worth investigating, who set the tune to music. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if the contribution of Margaret Cousins, who actually played the piano, is a bit underestimated or a bit neglected in that tune. In that
Because it's an industry that is constitution making. You have this complete documentation of somebody like the artist from Shantanu Kedan, who did the calligraphy and who designed the constitution has been documented. But this part of our national anthem is not being documented even now. It's still scattered.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the subject of the book, but you know that the national anthem is first written, and there is a theory, and I'm not subscribing to it upfront, but there's definitely a theory that is worthy of debate. That it was actually for King George, and the places that it mentions are all places in British India, Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat, and Maratha, Dravidic, Kalinga. Now, Tagore later said no. That controversy was never been totally extinguished. So the issue about that, I mean, I still haven't seen them. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to run it down anyway. But the national anthem was a work in progress written and then written again in one language, set to music at a certain time. There's an issue about Subhash Chandra Bose actually gives his okay to it, sitting there, which I think went a long way in making this converting this as a national anthem. But that's not the subject of this book. But yes, Tagore was in Northern Pali, and
So one aspect which you have documented is the amount of things which happened during the evacuation. Imagine when after return, they discovered that their places have been looted, vandalized. When you able to quantify the amount of loss?
that's a very good question, and that was very much on my mind. I'm so happy you asked that because it was like, okay, uh, if my house, if our house was completely ransacked, and there's anecdotal evidence that this was happening in other houses. In Cochin, for instance, these were supposed to hide as they go, they was picking up whatever they wanted. Um, did it reflect in any official statistics of the time? So I tried to do this by looking at the fortnightly reports, which has a crime column at the back. And I wasn't able to find anything conclusive in this respect. And I'm not sure why. Maybe because, there was such chaos at this time when most of it, when most people leave, who files the case? I don't think my grandparents never filed a case. The chowkidar that they were trying to look after the house, he himself left. And they came back a year later and found an empty house. And I think that happened in more than one case, but I'm not sure if it was properly recorded. At least I tried, but I failed to find substantiate that with statistics. So I couldn't get any statistics on that great increase in one kind of crime.
This planning, for reading the book, very clearly says a plan for decolonialization and leading to the independence. How did the becomes the driving force for liberalization or liberating country. Um, I think events of 42, uh, I think the events of 42, I think played a role because I think one thing it etched in the Indian mind. So what happens in Malaya and so on? The British left Malaya. They surrendered Singapore. The Andaman Island, even before the Japanese came in, they moved there, the small amount of troops they had, and they just let the Japanese take it. Hong Kong, which they thought could not be defended, they gave up without much of a fight. I mean, it was pretty much, they were quite certain as a part of military strategy, they would not defend it. And after a while, they would not defend Malaya. They said, let's fall back to Singapore. That's more important. So in the Indian Union, this question was asked in the Central Legislative Assembly, hey, if you can walk out of Malaya, surrender Singapore, you could do the same to us. You say that you are here to protect us and so on and so forth. How vested are you in this country? So this was a question that manifested itself in the Indian mind very, very much at that time. It also signaled that an Asian, Japan ran through Southeast Asia. They just leaped through it. There was not a single battle that Britain won at that time. Not a single one. Yeah, every battle was won by the Japanese, whether it was Jitra, Alostar, Singapore. Britain was just on the back foot all the time. This was Japan on the rampage. And given that, it was like it signaled that an Asian power could take on the Japanese signal that an Asian power could defeat a Western power. And that also, I think, had some kind of subliminal impact on the people. And the British complained over and over again, and this is another thing that you don't need in straightforward national history, that their propaganda is failing. That people are listening to German radio and Japanese radio. There's enough evidence of in their communication with each other, hey, we're losing the propaganda war. And they try very hard, as you know, to win the propaganda war. They even conscript a man like George Orwell, who's anything but an imperialist or colonialist, to do two programs aimed at India, one literary and the other news. So they're extremely worried by what's happening here because this is a population that is beginning to think, okay, maybe you lose the war, as Gandhi, I think, thought at one time. And, this could be an opportunity for us to press the British for more concessions. And I think all that had a great impact on the events. The Japan had an impact on the cost to our freedom. And I'll say one more thing in the way it did. I think if you look at the people who the Japanese captured in Malaya and then Singapore, I don't have the absolute stats, but the vast majority of them went over to the INA. Yeah, it was only a small number of people who held out, and even those people who held out, famous people like Prem Sehgal, who was the husband of the lady who led the Rani of Jhansi, Lakshmi. Yeah, he joined too after a while. So the British were aware that they were ruling India through the army, and if the Indian army just revolts, they can't hold it. So I think 42 sends signals there that look, this is an issue. As long as we can't command the army, and there were more and more Indian officers because of what depended that, unlike World War I, which was a surprise. More and more Indian officers, more and more people, going to Sandhurst. It was a different army. And then you had 46, you had the naval mutiny in Bombay. So I think it's impossible to discount the impact of all of this on, the freedom that we got finally at the end. So one thing which one can really understand from your book is impact of 42 into 47. What is the impact of 42 in post 47 Indian society? In post 47 Indian society. Do you think that there are many remnants of the way the state behaved, the evacuation, the way institutions behaved during that evacuation, and the way we have amnesia about what happened? You know those things. Do you think that 42 has casted shadow in post 47 India?
I, do- I mean, I think these had impacts on the British definitely and had impacts on us because I think it made us stronger, made us think that, yeah, we can get rid of, we can overthrow or we can overcome the British. I think to the extent, yes. Events of 1942, as to use your expression, we sort of developed an visual. And there's a reason for this. I mean, take Burma. Yeah. At least 500,000 people marched from the south up to the north, came through two routes, came to Calcutta. Many died on the way. Cholera, they were robbed, they were raped, they were killed. It's an extraordinary story, which you think of as the forgotten down march, referring to Mercy Town's march. How many people wrote detailed accounts of it? Very, very few. There's a snippet, a snatch there. Somebody told me, father was man, and to that. But there is nothing comprehensive record. And even Tinker admits that in the great essay that he wrote, saying that, we don't have this. And I think this is true of this period as well. Indians are not very, very recorders of events, certain kinds of events. I mean, we've the Constitution being well recorded and grant that. But this kind of event was not recorded properly either by the media or by the people. I mean, you and I talked about common sources. You helped me with, Pujana Patel had written a short story, but you helped me with the letters that he wrote to his wife, which suggested that, like many people in Madras, he sent his wife away because women and children were the first people to be sent away all over India. But there again, how many people wrote this? I did try to mine some, Tamil newspapers to think, okay, the English newspapers may have missed the story. Maybe I'm the Vikatan or Swadeshi Literate might have more information. And I couldn't find it.
So there was one interesting essay which I read much later, which I thought I should have told you.
Okay.
That was by Ashok Mitran. It was based in Gemini Studio. He says that there was a manager in the staff in Gemini Studio in the story department saying that the film Chandralekha was sent to Japan because Japan refused us to evacuate, and sending Chandralekha was taking revenge. That was what it was written in that essay. And that essay was later published in Slowly Making. It's a series. It's called Working Under Robert West. It's about working with the SS Wasson and Commodore. That I thought I should have flagged. Yeah, I would have used it. Then it's such a good story. The difference I found connected to cinema was in MSS Pandian, where he cites a Tamil biography, which is a kind of hagiography, which is the suggestion I get when I read it, where some lady who's written this biography, MGR says, "Oh, he was very brave. He didn't leave Madras at that time." So it was almost as if it was not just cinematic bravery, but he was also brave in real life. But I couldn't find much else. I'm sure there is snippets here and there, but I still think there isn't anything like a book on it or a large scale a study of it. I'd be surprised if there is. Before opening, we would like you to read one paragraph which you think is very interesting. Where is it?
A paragraph?
A page. Independent.
Okay, I don't know where to go. Okay, I'll just read the last two or three paragraphs of the introduction, which relates to what we talk about. So, and there's a little bit of Madras in it. So memories of 1942 largely revolve around the announcement of the CRIPS mission, its eventual failure, the launch of the Quit India movement, the arrests of top Congress leaders, and so on. These are regarded by nationalists as an integral part of the chronicle of India's struggle for freedom. In British eyes, these were events in a comforting story about the peaceful transfer of power. In contrast, the Great Flap of 1942 is bereft of an ending and wanting of a historical climax. The Japanese didn't show up after all. The tizzy over the invasion was much ado about nothing. Maybe it was. But there's no reason why histories like fiction cannot be stories without ends. Open-endedness may have relegated the story to being largely ignored, but it is this very character that lends it a fascinatingly fictional feel. That so much fear, disruption, and upheaval could have happened because of a non-event is best reflected by the madness that gripped Madras, the first Indian city of British Empire. A couple of days after lumbering Atlanta, which is a plane, sighted Japanese aircraft off the coastline, the British government received military intelligence, which is really false intelligence, of a large-scale Japanese invasion south of the city. On the following day, the Madras Presidency's Governor Arthur Hope issued a communique asking all those whose presence was not essential to leave. Already were given rumors that Madras would be the next Japanese target. The evacuation order only completed the chaos. Roads were jammed with people fleeing with their belongings on foot, in cars and bullock carts. The railways were overrun. By the middle of April, something between 75 and 90% of the city's population had evacuated. The government's decision to move most of its departments to a scattering of inland towns made things even worse. The bulk of British officials and European residents left. These included judges of the Madras High Court, which was split and transferred to two towns, Anandpur and Coimbatore. Food was in short supply, prices were steeply, and empty houses were routinely ransacked by thieves. In the welter of confusion and chaos, the government ordered that all dangerous animals in Madras be shot dead. The fear was that Japanese bombs could destroy zoo enclosures and free animals such as lions, tigers, bears, and snakes, and turn them perilously loose on what remained of the citizenry. The Commissioner of Madras Corporation, O. Pilla Reddy, one of the few senior officials ordered to stay behind, was tasked with organizing the murders at the zoo. Reddy, who believed that an imminent Japanese invasion was highly unlikely, tried to reason with the Commissioner of Police, Lionel Gasson, that shooting the animals dead would be hasty and premature, but to no avail. The Malabar police, which was called in to do the job, carried out the operation with cold and clinical efficiency, finishing the job in a few blood-spattered minutes. On this day of madness, Reddy recalled in disbelief, everybody seemed to have lost his head. Thank you. Okay, now I will show questions, please. Okay. Yes, hello, thank you. Question relates a little bit to the passage you described that from the commissioner who didn't think Japanese invasion was. Yeah, can you just put the mic a little bit further? Question relates a little bit more. Really, to what you just discussed, and also something you mentioned earlier about journalism. The officially mentioned who the Japanese invasion was at, and trying to convince that he should not carry out this action. I was just curious, what are your voices of dissent against this war going on in the country? You mentioned that in journalism, most of the
really running the way it is today, when it might have been, forthright about this actually being unlikely. You're dissent against this reaction? Against people, the idea of contribution. So, yeah, that's a very good question. The interesting thing is that it was the British papers, particularly the Statesman, that argued most vehemently against evacuation. They took the line that evacuation was just being, that the government was sort of encouraging this kind of madness. And so, for instance, in Calcutta, the director of evacuation is appointed. And the statement writes the stinging editorial, where do you expect people to go? The Panes, somewhere else. They're very strong in this because they see this as a loss of credibility in the face of government. If you take the nationalists, ironically, but Gandhi, for instance, argued that look, if people are scared, some people argue that people are unarmed, and there is a threat of an invasion, which there is a lot of misinformation that the British themselves were feeding into the Indian public. Obviously, they'll go. So it's not such a bad thing. So Gandhi actually wasn't opposed to evacuation. At one time, he actually argued that his and the British position was very similar, but they arrived at this position for different reasons. So this is an ironic contrast that took place. But there were skeptics, the Madras Weekly, which is again a British newspaper, which was here. There was carried some extremely interesting letters from readers saying, what is all this fuss about? Why are we, accusing the government of actually encouraging this? And there's one aspect which we hadn't talked about, is that the British believed that the less people there would be in towns and cities, the more easy it would be to manage in case the Japanese bomb were attacked. And this shocking kind of communication is repeated over and over again in communication between Viceroy Lindipur and various governors all over the country. So the expression they use is useless marks, inessentials and non-essentials. That's a good thing that useless marks leave. And who's the useless mark? We're looking at this in the context of the world. Anyone not engaged in essential services or production is a useless mark. That's a good thing if he leaves or she leaves. So they tacitly encourage this happening. And the dilemma they have, and this dilemma is actually reflected in their own writings and communication, is here, if you put out an advisory asking people to leave, asking useless marks to leave, maybe some marks which are not so useless will leave as well, and then that will affect us at all. So the governors in Bombay, the governors in Calcutta, for instance, Governor Herbert in Calcutta wants to issue such an advisory. And then the military establishment is telling him, if you do this, a lot of essential people will leave, but then we won't have anything to carry out a war with. Because Calcutta is a big, is an important center of the production of metal and other things related to the war effort. So this was their dilemma. Next question, please.
Sure.
So I was interested in what you were saying about the nationalist response to the idea of a Japanese invasion. And you said from the nationalist point of view, it was positive development, that it was a way of perceiving that an Asian power could seem to be what you suggested. And I was just, I suppose I had a question about that, because surely it was just what it would be, the result of a Japanese invasion would be the shifting of one kind of colonialism to another. Why would the nationalists necessarily have a boost from that
Great question. I think if I said what you said, I said, then I didn't mean to say that. I said there was a climate of opinion in the country that was, in a way, anti-British, and in a way, they didn't felt okay about possible Japanese invasion. Gandhi himself, in one of his writings, says there are four kinds of people. That were like very small number of people who are against any kind of war. Another who's like position, and then he says there's a large people, possibly a large body of people who think, it's okay if the Japanese come because they'll throw out the British work. So that was not so much a nationalist party political position, but a feeling. People were tuning into Berlin radio, people were tuning into this, and these facts are not actually, they got somehow they, not played up. But there was a section in India, and Gandhi himself, and this is one of the aspects in the book. Nehru himself says this of Gandhi. Nehru's biographer says this of Gandhi Gopal. And Nehru and Gandhi himself is accused of adopting a pro-Japanese position. And he actually writes explaining why he is not pro-Japan in some respects. And, there is, Nehru believed that Gandhi thought that Japan would win the war. Azad thought that Gandhi thought that Japan would win the war. The British definitely thought it. Cripps says it. So did Nehru, who was the commander-in-chief. And I think if you're talking about nationalist parties, different politicians have different views. And this is one of the things that, Nehru was firmly anti-fascist. And, after Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, attack on the Soviet Union, he was pretty clear which side of defense he was on. Okay? Men like Rajagopalachari and Nehru, to some extent, they aligned themselves, were saying that, look, Britain is weak now. Let's negotiate with them and push for more reform. They're fighting a war. Gandhi's position was, no, I'm not doing anything to embarrass the British at this time. It was a position that he had in 1939. And one of the curious things that happens is that the person who was seen on the most moderate or the most right of the Congress Party, suddenly in 1942, just completely does a change. And he's actually asking for British rule. And I think this is one of the unanswered or not fully explained questions in Indian history. What makes Gandhi change in 1942? It's such an important question. I've tried to mine history writing for this. It's put up there. If you read Sumit Sarkar's history, it said suddenly Gandhi, there was a radical change. But my question would be why? So there is hints of this in Nehru's writing, and Gandhi as well in his biography, Gandhi mentioned it. But it's a very personal explanation that he was getting on in years, that he needed to, he felt he needed to do something. The people that he was close to him, like say Andrew Zadat, they are passing away. And so he felt it was time to act in some way. But Gandhi, right through until the end of 1942, where he takes a slightly different stance, the reasons why he was so anti-Japan as Nehru was, firmly anti-fascist, firmly on side of the other. Gandhi saw a moral equivalence between aggression and counter-aggression. I mean, he's telling look, if you attack Hitler, what's the difference between you and him? So, and Nehru himself, if you read the Discovery of India, there's actually hints that, Gandhi didn't have, he doesn't say that in so many words, but he suggests that Gandhi didn't have a sort of ideological worldview. So he was driven more by this idea that, this complete abjuration of any violence. If somebody came and hit you, be hit. He told the Abyssinians, don't fight. He told the Jews, if it was not the British, fight me. So this was an odd position. So Gandhi was against British supporting the British war effort. Whereas Nehru and the others were saying, let's support the British war effort, but it has to come with riders and conditions. You have to give us more of that, which is why Cripps was sent. The entire Cripps mission, as you know, was to buy, Indian support for the war in exchange for some refund. Of course, the refund didn't go far enough, but that's another story. And Gandhi was completely opposed to Cripps. He refuses to meet Cripps. He says, he knows what Cripps is there for. Cripps is there to win his support for the war effort. Which is why there is a body of British historians, and Indian historians don't accept this. They believe it was Gandhi who single-handedly scuppered the Cripps mission, which of course Nehru doesn't accept, and Nehru's biographer doesn't accept, and most historians don't accept. Maybe it's too simplistic. But there's no doubting his opposition to it, fierce opposition to it, at a time when Rajagopalachari was very, very keen on arriving at a solution, and so was Nehru from all accounts. So I think this is what I meant. I didn't mean to say that, the Congress leaders or the leaders actually were Japan. That's not what I meant. One last question, please. Parvati?
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in the process. What drew you to it, and what was the process of writing? How did you have access to all of these archives? As you said, so little is recorded about so many aspects of Indian history. So, was there a journey in terms of uncovering material that you could study for this?
Yeah, so this, I wrote this book in a fairly haphazard fashion. I wrote with what material I had. And because of COVID, I couldn't travel to the British Library in England. That was the last leg of research. And then I finished the book within a year of that. But so it wasn't the conventional way of writing a book at all. But it was because of external circumstances. But essentially, what I found is that many of the histories that we write depend a lot on the fortnightly reports that are put out. So fortnightly reports are reports put out by the chief secretary of a province to the home secretary, and they go out they can go out, the governor to the, we go out this way. But there is, now that the biblical papers are accessible, there is a whole range of communication, telegrams and so on, that the Viceroy has with various governors. And the story of the flat actually, or at least the lesser known events in the flat, like the move from Cuttack to Sambalpur and so on, have been gleaned from this lot of communication. And from the private papers of some ICS officers, which this magnificent institution, British Library, just retains, and you can walk in and access. So I think that is where I think I was able to push, if you like, the story a little further. Essentially, it was there. I found the Madras archives quite meaningful. Jews, we become trust the Jews. They said they probably given it to the public department of the Tamil Nadu government. I went there and they said, yeah, nothing. So I drew a kind of blank with Tamil Nadu archives. But there's done as well, the Shasam. But it was essentially the government which provided most of it. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. To speak on your new book next year. I don't know about next year, but let's see how that goes. Thank you so much for making pleasure to talk to you. By the way, I think, I just want to say thank you so much. It's great being here. And and I have colleagues for many years in the Hindu and worked across not so far from each other. And he's even sort of big himself. So recently, which has about 11 acclaim. So So my privilege and value hope remains in session. Thank you so much.